While on a business trip, I saw something in my husband's room that shattered me. I had rehearsed the speech in my head a dozen times on the taxi ride, a small, polite thing to say into a phone at 2 in the morning. We need to talk when I get back. The truth, of course, had already shifted under my feet by the time I wheeled my suitcase down the beige hotel corridor and knocked on the wrong door. His door, not mine. The speech felt like a relic from a life I no longer knew how to own. I remember the way the handle turned with a soft, mechanical sigh, and how the light inside caught on the edge of something that did not belong to the neat, curated marriage I had negotiated into being. For a second, there was only the thud of my heart and the echo of my own shoes on the carpet, and then I saw it, a photograph, face down on the nightstand, half covered by a receipt from a restaurant we had never been to, a cheap matchbook from a bar downtown with its name scrawled in block letters, the atlas, and the silly, intimate scrap of a napkin on which someone had written a "See you Thursday," in a looping hand so unlike my own. The photograph's edges curled when I flipped it with fingers that felt foreign, my breath lodged in my throat. There she was, the woman I had never seen smiling at the camera, hair cropped in a style my husband had once said he found a brave, wearing a dress that somehow made her look both younger and older than she should be. The picture was taken close up. You could see the freckles at the corner of her nose, the faint scar at her chin. You could see in her eyes the kind of calm that betrayed no secrets at all. My husband's face was in the picture too, just a sliver. His jaw, the collar of his shirt, the same mole above the lip I had loved the first time I kissed him. The world pitched. I did not scream. I did not drop the photo. I could feel my hands trembling, but not enough to let it blot the picture with tears. Instead, I walked into the room as though the door's threshold were a legal boundary. I had every right to cross and watched him, my husband of 7 years, the man who had promised me late summer weddings and Saturday lawn mowing, the man who knocked on the kitchen door in the morning to steal the good coffee, be the sort of ordinary that felt suddenly obscene. He was folding a shirt, the same indifferent domesticity we had once shared, the lines of his shoulders, the familiar curve of his spine, the habit of rubbing his thumb over the seam when he was thinking. These small human things made it worse, not better, because they implied in us that was being quietly overwritten. He turned when he heard me, and for a breathless second, the man who loved me and the man in the photograph collided like two waves. His eyes slid, quick and guilty, over the photograph in my hand and then to my face. Somewhere behind him, the television played a low, anonymous drone. Sir, nothing. He said nothing. We both decided, silently and in different ways, that the night was a hinge on which everything would rotate. There are betrayals that explode, loud and scandalous. There are betrayals that smolder like a dropped cigarette in a pile of dry leaves. This one was a slow, patient burn. In the days that followed, I moved through ritual. I returned home, put the photograph into a shallow drawer, and arranged my face in a mask of business as usual for the people who expected me to be the composed wife, the competent marketing director, the woman who never lost her temper in public. At work, I gave presentations, signed deals, and smiled. At home, I learned to cook pasta she had never stood a chance against and set the table on Tuesdays because that was when I knew he liked the house to feel most like home. I learned how to be near him and not touch, to speak and not ask the question whose answer would demand more than I had to give. The photograph became a secret weather map in my life. Sometimes the sky inside my chest was a flat, exhausted gray. Other times there was lightning so bright it left after images. Then a series of small truths began to coalesce like dark constellations. The receipts tucked in pockets, the deleted text threads that left bare timestamps on our phones, the hotel loyalty points he suddenly had in places he never visited. Each one by itself could be rationalized or dismissed, but together they wrote a sentence I could no longer ignore. I hired a private investigator, a detail that feels ridiculous to confess now, both in the way it made me feel like a character in one of those late-night dramas and because it was the smartest, cruelest thing I did. The investigator was a quiet man with a voice like gravel and a notebook like a Bible. Ooh. He gave me names and places and times with the same dispassionate cadence with which he might have delivered the weather. He showed me, eventually, a slideshow of pictures taken from car windows, grainy and honest. My husband in a cafe, his back to the camera. My husband leaving an apartment carrying a duffel bag. My husband standing, hands in pockets against a backdrop of our city's skyline, laughing with the woman from the photograph. The laughter in the photo was different from the laugh we reserved for each other. It was a private laugh, a laugh that felt like the theft of something sacred. Confrontation is a strange, funny thing. You rehearse it and dramatize it until it becomes a myth that never happens because the real moment is too small. My confrontation was not thunder, but a long, dry wind. I did not throw the photograph at him like a grenade. Instead, I placed it on the kitchen table where the sunlight fell in a perfect, unforgiving strip and watched the way the light turned the glossy paper into a shard. He came in from the garage with a newspaper in his hands, the way men do when they are trying to armor themselves in routine. He saw the photo and the look on his face was like a map being erased. Sudden, terrible, and so complete the lines of his mouth disappeared. He started to say something about work, about stress, about a joke with a colleague. I watched him, and I realized in that moment that he was trying to rent the past in small installments. He was trying to buy my forgetfulness with explanations. How long? I asked, which was the same as saying, how much of me did you mean? He lied, and the lie was a smooth, practiced thing. He said a year, then 8 months. Then it didn't mean anything. His hands, which had been steady for our daughter's first haircut and shaky when he carried a sick dog into the vet, were suddenly the hands of a stranger who could still remember how to feign remorse. I could have walked away then. I could have taken the photograph and the receipts and the proof of lies and left him to his apartment and his laugh, and our bed where his side would always smell faintly of someone else. Walking away is an act that many wise friends suggested I commit. You deserve better, they said, and they were right. And if I were writing this as an op-ed about healing, I would end the paragraph there with the woman who had the courage to step out into the bright, clean air of independence. But this story is not about the simple heroism of leaving. It is about the slow, elegant cruelty of choosing a different kind of justice. I wanted something more than cold freedom. I wanted the truth to be known in a way that cut through the polite, private calculus of our lives. The first stage of my revenge was not public. It was surgical and intimate. I began to collect evidence. Not only the receipts and the screenshots, but the small, human documents that tethered him to the lie. A subscription under a different email. A locker key number at a gym I had never heard him mention. An envelope with his name on it. And a foreign return address. I became an archivist of deceit, and the archive opened windows I had not known existed. The woman, her name was Sophie, according to a series of emails I read with the numb detachment of a person cataloging an unfathomable species, was, as it turned out, part of a more complicated story. She lived 2 neighborhoods away. She had pets that she photographed with ridiculous affection and shared recipes on social media that my husband liked sometimes and shared other times with a heart emoji that meant nothing to me and everything to the brutal ledger I kept in my head. Sophie was not a villain. She was a woman who, like me, had fallen for a man whose promises were elastic and selective. The real fault, I decided, lay less in the other woman and more in the man who had carved his life into 2 neat, dishonest halves. Revenge, when you plot it in the gray hours of insomnia, can look like a set of moral calculations. What would hurt him most? What would make him feel the loss of control he had accrued by For me, the answer was humiliation in a public place where he had been used to commanding respect. His office, his name, his reputation. He had built himself a reputation as a reliable, attentive manager, the kind of leader who signed off on budgets and remembered birthdays with little notes. So I undermined it, not with lies, but with truth dressed in a way that could not be ignored. I filed for a divorce. The legal papers were precise and cold, and for a while they made me feel saintly and terrible at once. He was stunned and furious, and for the first time exposed to the eyes of the people who had once admired him. That was not enough. I began carefully to reveal the story, not to friends, Those conversations felt tainted and petty. I contacted colleagues, not to smear him, but to give them the information their proximity deserved, that the man they trusted at the top of the table had been living a double life. I sent copies of receipts and a timeline, and I let the dominoes of rumor do the rest. What I had not counted on was empathy's odd, slippery entrance. People who had once cheered his pithy emails now found themselves blinking at the news with an awkward mix of disbelief and sorrow. Some left his company, some stayed. Our daughter, Mila, was caught in the crossfire more than I had planned. She was 7 and had the effortless cruelty and love of kids. He loved both of us as if the world were an equation whose answers could be split. I wanted vindication, yes, but I also wanted to protect the small human whose life was being rearranged. To that end, my revenge shaped itself into something subtler. I fought not only to reveal his infidelity, but also to ensure that the safety net he had relied on, the legal and financial scaffolding we had built together, would not be used as a cushion for his fall. I engaged lawyers who were precise and unflinching. I took care to make decisions that protected Mila's future rather than inflict gratuitous pain. Revenge, in other words, became legal and moral architecture as much as emotional satisfaction. There were nights when revenge tasted like copper. I called vendors, canceled joint accounts, and convinced a board member to question his choices in a meeting that would make the uncertainty bloom. The man I had loved went from comfortable to vulnerable, and seeing him there created in me a complex, even guilty satisfaction. He tried to bargain. He offered explanations. He offered counseling. He offered the old performative affection. He offered, most indignantly, apologies that seemed to be crafted to fit the contours of my rage. "Oh, I made a terrible mistake," he said once, in a voice that trembled with practiced contrition. I accepted none of it. Instead, I filed an incriminating but honest complaint about the abuse of company resources, gently worded, legally sound, and devastating in its implications. The company's internal review was discreet but effective. He was suspended pending investigation, and his reputation, once solid as bedrock, acquired the fissures of rumor. But revenge is not a straight arrow. It ricochets, it hits bystanders, it comes back to you. The community of our friends fractured. Mutual acquaintances chose sides. My in-laws wept in a kitchen I had once decorated for their anniversary. I watched the fallout and realized that while I had sought justice, I had also created a cascade whose reach extended further than I had intended. For a while, I apologized for the violence of truth, though not for telling it. I apologized to my daughter for the sadness we had to endure, to my mother for the gossip that found its way to her book club, to myself for the small, ugly pleasure I felt when the man who had deceived me stumbled. Apologies, I learned, were not a balm for heartache. They were merely a way to hold pieces together so the people who mattered could move forward. The turning point, if a story like this admits of tidy turning points, came not in court or in the quiet of negotiated settlements, but in the ordinary, stubborn day that followed the judicial theater. I had imagined a cinematic climax, public shaming, the other woman vanishing in shame, my husband reduced to a humbled penitent. Reality, as ever, refused such simplicity. Sophie reached out, not with hatred but with an unexpected grace. She wrote a letter, typed, careful and absurdly human, explaining that she had loved my husband fiercely and without knowledge of his other life. She said she was ashamed, sorry, and terrified for the ways her presence had caused pain. She spoke of the small humanness of being in love with someone who could split himself into halves and hope that we would both find lives that did not require such halves. Reading her words, raw and vulnerable, unspooled a new kind of grief inside me. Not the bright, righteous kind that had fueled my first steps toward revenge, but a cold, complicated sorrow for the way people break one another. Sophie was not the enemy. The enemy had been a collection of lies and the cowardice to let them grow. The divorce was finalized in winter, a season that seemed to fit the chill of our new arrangement. We negotiated custody with tense civility. We divided assets with the precision of people who had begun to see one another as opposing counsel rather than partners. In the paperwork, there was an uneasy fairness. He would leave the house, He would pay a portion of the child support we both knew was necessary, and he would go somewhere else to reconstruct the life he had dismantled. The settlement was not total victory. It was a settlement legal and moral, the best of terrible choices. The city roared on as if nothing had happened. The lights stayed the same, the coffee carts sold their usual paper cups of weak espresso, and the subway trains continued to smell faintly of metal and yesterday's rain. Time, the relentless craftsman, did its work. I started seeing a therapist, an honest, unrushed woman who taught me that revenge, like grief, needed to be processed lest it calcify into a second betrayal of myself. She helped me transform the energy of fury into something that built rather than destroyed. Slowly, almost by accident, I began to remember the parts of myself I had shelved to keep the marriage working. The small, ferocious joy of writing fiction, the ease with which I could lose an afternoon at the botanical gardens with no plan but to notice. I applied for a job that paid less but fed me in ways money could not. I moved into a smaller apartment, painted one wall an impossible blue, and bought a plant that refused to be anything but green. I learned to lie in bed at night without cataloging his absence, and I learned to listen to my daughter when she told me, without malice, that she missed him. I learned that forgiveness was a ladder I might never climb for his sake, but that mercy, in small deliberate doses, could make room in my heart for things other than rage. And yet vengeance leaves marks. There were nights when I dreamed of the photograph, the curve of Sophie's smile, the casual way, when life had been bisected. Sometimes I wondered whether the man I had punished would carry the lesson forward with humility, or whether he would slink into another double life elsewhere, witless and unchanged. I took comfort in the small, measurable changes. He later remarried. It was public in the way most desperate choices are, and the world, always hungry for the next plot, moved on. He lost some friends, kept up. He learned perhaps the cost of duplicity not through rhetoric but through the real penalties he paid. A diminished reputation, the loss of a house, the slow rebuilding of trust in professional spaces where charisma had once sufficed. The most satisfying, quiet revenge I eventually realized was simply building a life that did not circle around his choices. My daughter's laughter began to return, my nights filled with books that were not about the past, but about the possible. My new love, if that word is too big, call it companionship, arrived like sunlight in a room I had cleared to let it in. This companion was not dramatic or cinematic. He was steady, a man who listened without cataloging, who loved my daughter on days when my patience frayed, and who loved me in ways that required no ledger. The story's last chapters are not a tidy victory. They are quieter. A dinner at a restaurant where the waiter knows our names. A school recital where I cry so hard my mascara runs, and my daughter says, "Oh, Mom, stop," and kisses me on the forehead. A holiday where the guest list is small and sincere. I learned to set boundaries and to keep secrets that were kinder than the vengeance I had once sought. I learned that the photograph which had once been a blade could become a teaching tool for a child about the complexities of adults, and that the worst of betrayals need not define the rest of one's life. And when I pass the place called the Atlas on the street, I no longer feel the fork of memory. I feel something like relief that painful things can be survived. If there is a moral to this messy American-style revenge tale, it is not the tidy moral of retribution. It is that truth, when wielded with fierce intelligence and moral restraint, can be a remedy, but also a weapon that must be used carefully, else it maims the wielder. I had wanted to be avenged. I learned to want something better, a life that owed me nothing and yet gave me everything in the quiet currency of self-respect. In the end, what shattered me in that hotel room was not merely a photograph. It was the sudden, painful recognition that the life I had been living was not wholly mine. What I rebuilt afterwards, no less real for being slower and less spectacular, was not just a life without him, but a life that finally belonged to me. If you ask whether I regretted the revenge, I will tell you this. For a long time I thought the answer was no, because the consequence of truth felt like righteous fire. But now, years later, I would say the answer is more complicated. I do not regret standing up for myself. I regret the collateral sorrow that sometimes followed. I have learned at last that justice and tenderness can be companions if we let them be, and that the most revolutionary act is sometimes not to punish, but to patiently, stubbornly, and lovingly choose joy after sorrow.